Birds rely on cues that include the length of the day to help determine when to migrate. But warmer than average temperatures, earlier springs and longer summers can throw off the critical timing of that migration. That really reveals the complexity of the ecological interdependencies between plants, insects, and birds. Insects prefer the tender young foliage that first emerges, because plants, as a defense mechanism, tend to develop toxins in their foliage as they mature, and thus earlier springs mean the insects need to emerge earlier in the season. So insects also don't migrate by and large. They hatch, they grow, they mate, they lay eggs, and they die all within a single season. Birds, however, they're coming back. They're traveling thousands and thousands of miles each year, and they judge their departure time based on a fixed parameter of the season, like the length of the day. And thus, they risk arriving too late after the insect larvae have already come and gone, and they depend on those larvae to feed their own young. For the Cape May warbler, this largely represents a risk to the next generation, not the current generation of birds, because it impacts their ability to feed their young. But having a larger overall population size and having a broader distribution, of course, benefit the species as a whole, because it helps them weather other risks to their survival. Increasingly, during migration itself, the Cape May warbler has another dietary specialization that it utilizes before it arrives to take those to take those spruce budworms. The birds have a tubular tongue, which is almost unique among warblers, and they use that tongue to drink nectar from flowers, from hummingbird feeders, from the wells that sapsuckers drill in trees, and they even will eat grapes. So as for this specialization on spruce budworms, you might ask, how do humans affect that? I told you the spruce budworms have been there for thousands of years, experiencing those boom and bust cycles. Well, here's where that comes into play. The boom populations of the larvae kill off large tracts of forest. And in response, the traditional human approach has been to use widespread organic pesticide application to control the budworm. That has negative effects on the bird population as well. So by understanding the ecological niches and the effectiveness of different spraying regimes, such as when, how much, and even which compounds to use in spraying for the budworms, those are essential in both dealing with the pests and preserving the habitat for the birds that depend on them. Likewise, logging activities can deprive the birds of mature woods. Those closely managed woods, they typically don't have sufficient time for the replanted trees to grow and develop that healthy insect population. And without the insect population having rebounded, the birds don't have sufficient food. So the prior two species that I discussed were dietary specialists in their winter and summer habitats, respectively. That gives them advantages over other warblers with whom they share that habitat. I'm going to pivot now to talk about a species which is an extreme nesting habitat specialist. Not so much on its breeding season diet per se, but on the habitat itself. This dependency has led the Kirtland's warbler to the very brink of extinction, but through understanding the bird's specialized nesting habitat requirements, we humans have taken steps that have brought the species back. The Kirtland's warbler is thus both a cautionary tale as well as one of the greatest success stories for conservationists, much as its habitat specialization has given it advantages and risks of extinction. Kirtland's warbler was until very recently one of the single most endangered birds in the world. By the 1970s, there were estimates that only 400 of these birds remained in existence. Even after the Protection of the Endangered Species Act in 1973, the breeding population as late as 1987 was down to 187 singing males. Birders, conservationists, and scientists throughout the 70s and 80s despaired that we would lose this species altogether, that we would see it go the way of the passenger pigeon or the Carolina parakeet or some of the other birds that we have lost in historical times. So what led to this precipitous drop in Kirkland's warbler populations, and how did the bird recover to the point that today it's no longer listed as an endangered species? Now, key to understanding this is that the Kirtland's warbler is an extreme breeding site specialist. As you can see from this map, the Kirtland's warbler has very specific nesting ground needs, which are a significant limitation geographically. Its nesting habitat is found primarily in Michigan in 13 counties in the Lower Peninsula. That's the core breeding area indicated on this map. But through recent conservation efforts, we have seen the species expand that range slightly into the Upper Peninsula, into Wisconsin, and into Southern Ontario. So we'll see what's so special about that habitat in just a moment, and why that habitat led the species to the brink of extinction. So the Kirtland's warbler will only nest in jack pine scrub, and that is, they require forests that consist of jack pine trees in a very specific and narrow age range. Typically, they prefer forests that are populated almost entirely by trees from 8 to 15 years old. To understand why that is, start with the jack pine's own life cycle, which in nature is driven by periodic wildfires, which clear out the older forests and allow younger trees to regrow in their place. We see the Kirtland's warbler first enter new jack pine forests when the trees have reached at least 1.7 meters or about 5.5 feet in height, which occurs around 5 years of age for the tree. And the Kirtland's warbler rarely occupies forests that are older than 20 years because the trees have reached a height of 5 meters or 16.5 feet or taller. Now, Kirtland's warblers build their nests on the ground. The female digs out a shallow depression in the loose sandy soil, and then they line it with sedges and pine needles. Ground nesting is not unique even among warblers. I can think of several species such as the ovenbird that are known entirely for being terrestrial or ground feeding and nesting birds. But at the same time, you can probably imagine that nesting on the ground poses risks such as easier predator access. Regardless, there are reasons for this nest preference. They include the density of vegetation. So trees that have lower branches provide cover for the females and their nests and fledglings, and they provide protected foraging for the females who are feeding their young. As the trees age, older trees begin to shed their lower branches and lose that protection, whereas trees that are too young lack the small openings that the birds favor to go in and to and from their nests. And they also lack sufficiently high perches for the males to display and sing and do their own foraging. There's another reason. There's less competition. There's really not much bird life to begin with in these jack pine forests, but competing even with those other few species is limited based on the specialization of the Kirtland's warbler. For example, the prairie and palm warblers prefer to nest during earlier stages of forest succession with younger, shorter trees. And the Nashville warbler, which is another ground nesting species, prefers later stages when the trees are older and taller. In fact, as the forests age, the last Kirtland warblers to occupy trees over about 20 years of age tend to be unmated males, desperate to stake out a claim and find mates, even if the habitat is subpar. So here's really the key problem though. When you nest on the ground in a very geographically limited area, and you have very specialized requirements on the habitat surrounding that area, that puts you at significant risk if any of that is disrupted. So we humans, we don't find jack pine particularly useful. It doesn't make for good lumber. And we don't like wildfires. As I said, jack pine naturally burns regularly as part of its own life cycle. So thus, over the years, we cleared away the forest to make room for our houses and our agriculture, and we prevented wildfires that would have cleared away the older jack pines and given the younger trees a chance to reach that optimal height preferred by the Kirtland's warbler. Making things even worse, during the early 20th century, when we first discovered that they do nest in this area in the Lower Peninsula, locals realized that they could make a quick profit by going and finding those nests and selling them to museums, along with, in many cases, killing the parents to sell to the museums so they could have them in their displays. These factors, coupled with another big one, such as nest parasitism by the brown-headed cowbird, this really resulted in the very short timeline of mere decades, way too fast for the species to adapt, to nearly wipe out Kirtland's warbler. But I'm happy to say that Kirtland's warbler today, as I said, is one of the success stories of the American conservation movement. And that success is based upon understanding the ecological factors that contribute to this habitat specialization. In Michigan's Lower Peninsula, careful forage management maintained suitable jack pine forests. So this is an activity that is being done entirely by humans. So we're actually the ones taking care of the forest in a way that helps benefit these birds. In a purely natural setting, as I said, periodic wildfires would wipe out the older jack pines and allow the regrowth of younger trees. So, one option is controlled burns, and we actually use that practice to protect some species in the United States, like the Florida scrub jay. But even controlled burns might not be the best solution because the fires generate a lot of smoke and air pollution. And in those jack pine forests, there's always a risk that they could spread outside the intended area. So instead, what we did in Michigan is large tracts of jack pine forest have been dedicated and put aside to the bird's habitat, but to ensure and maintain that habitat has trees of the right height. They're actually planted and maintained in strips on an opposing wave schedule, where we go in and cut down vegetation above a certain height and replant it with younger trees, and manage that on a 50-year schedule so that there's always large contiguous stretches of forest that has trees of the warbler's preferred height and vegetation density available. And of course, protection under the Endangered Species Act helped curtail nest collection and nest disturbance by humans. Finally, the other key factor has been active management of the brown-headed cowbird across Kirtland's nesting range. Cowbirds are brood parasites. They lay their eggs in other birds' nests and then let the parasitized parents feed and rear their young. The larger cowbird young then often outgrow and outcompete the smaller babies that are in the nest, and sometimes even push them out of the nest entirely. To adapt to this, some species will attempt to remove cowbird eggs that are laid in their nests. Others, unfortunately, abandon their nests, eggs and all, altogether when they find a cowbird egg has been laid within it. So through trapping and removal of cowbirds, conservationists helped ensure Kirtland's warbler pairs had the best chance of successfully rearing their babies each and every year. Whereas previously, those cowbird parasites led to up to 1/3 of nests failing. These efforts, as I said, they were successful enough that the breeding population is today made up of over 2,000 pairs of birds, and the species has been downgraded to near threatened rather than listed as endangered. So I hope you found the accounts of these three specializations among warblers interesting. But what's next? In researching the backgrounds of the many species I've photographed and observed, one thing that has struck me is just how little we actually know about so many of the birds with whom we share our planet. Without understanding the life cycles, their nesting and breeding behavior, and their needs for diet and habitat, these species can decline and pass the brink before we even understand why or how to help. We know so little about most tropical species. For example, in researching the accounts of many tanagers, babblers, flycatchers, and other species that we rarely, if ever, get to see here in the United States, but which are relatively common in Central America, like the tanagers and hummingbirds, and Southeast Asia, like the gigantic taxonomic mess of birds we call babblers, I've too often found that we simply just don't know that much, if anything, about how the species mate, where they nest, how they rear their young, or what their migratory movements might be, if any. So that poses a real challenge. How can we work to both live within this planet, make use of its resources, but also coexist with these species if we don't even understand the ecology in which they currently live? Even within the small selection of warblers that I discussed today, little is known about the Cape May's breeding cycle. There's no research published at all about how they do incubation of their eggs, what the growth and development of their young are, what the parental care looks like, and many other factors that impact the reproductive success of the Cape May warbler. Thus, if you're interested in biology as a profession and not afraid of a bit of field work, there are literally thousands of species just waiting to be studied. But what about now? Or if, like me, biology doesn't turn out to be your career, you can still contribute to the science of understanding birds today. For example, anyone can work with Cornell University's Lab of Ornithology to report their bird sightings, whether as part of the annual Christmas bird counts that take place across the United States, or every day using eBird. You can check that out at ebird.org or download the eBird app for your smartphone to record your observations. And you can do that for your own backyard, out your office window, your school window. You can do it when you're traveling on the road. This citizen science helps us learn when birds visit a particular area and also in what numbers. A rare visitor, a bird who arrives weeks early or late in migration, that's noteworthy in and of itself. But the relative frequencies of the birds that we observe is very important as well. For example, are numbers of common species on the rise or decline? And being able to control for factors like the leaf out times, daylight length, average temperature, and more, and correlate that with solid bird species observations is what helps us all understand the changing world around us and how it affects the birds that we live with. And finally, there are steps you can take at home, at school, or at work to improve the environment and make it a friendlier place for birds. You can plant more native species. Both insects and the birds who feed upon them depend on those native species to flourish. You can practice as much pesticide-free gardening as possible. Those pesticides not only kill the bugs you're trying to get rid of, but it also kills the bugs the birds need as part of their diet. And in some cases, the pesticides themselves directly harm birds. Look no further than the persistent organic pesticides like DDT, which once threatened countless species across the United States, including our national emblem, the bald eagle, and which wiped out the pelican state, that's Louisiana's, entire population of brown pelicans at one point. Rachel Carson's seminal book, Silent Spring, in no small part documented that impact of pesticide use on bird populations and rallied the environmental movement of the 1970s, which in turn helped reverse many of the worst losses and gave those threatened populations the time they needed to recover. Provide habitat, not just lawn. Birds need both shelter in the form of understory trees and brush, as well as suitable areas to nest and food sources to get them through the winter, such as some of our native plants that produce fruits and berries, like some of the hollies, for example. Although the warblers I showed you today all breed in the extreme northern United States and Canada, there are many other species, including some warblers, who do nest right here in the mid-Atlantic. And by providing them suitable habitat to feed and nest within, you're taking steps crucial to their survival. And indeed, that would be the case wherever you may be. Less lawn also means less mowing and less work keeping those lawns lush and green. When we bought this home in 2008, the backyard was an absolute blank slate consisting entirely of shady, thin grass tucked into the corner next to some deep woods that were protected under county parkland. In the 14 years since we've lived here, we've remade much of that habitat and transformed our backyard into a lush landscape filled with native understory trees and shrubs. The main photo above is from 2014. And when I was putting this presentation together, my wife laughed when she saw it, saying, "Really, you should show it as it is now." In fact, at this moment, if I look out my window, I can't even see into the back corner where our pond is, thanks to the amount of lush greenery that has grown up and filled the space in. And the little small inset picture there shows at the very early spring some more of that density. You can imagine as it's leafed out now that you can't even see much beyond that Tory gate. So the front lawn, we've now turned it into a native pollinator meadow, and it's filled with wildflowers that you see from early spring through the end of fall, and it's filled with butterflies, bees, and birds year-round. I want to wrap up with one last warbler, the northern parula. The northern parula is a little bit more of a generalist, it's true, but I offer the parula up as a contrast to the other species that I focused on today. The northern parula shares its common name with the entire family of wood warblers, the Parulidae. So its name came about when the naturalist Carl Linnaeus thought the species was a variety of Old World tit when he first described it, and he placed it in the genus Parus alongside them as Parus americanus, or the American tit. As our understanding of the taxonomy of New World birds grew, eventually naturalists placed the northern parula in a separate genus, which later served to inspire the family name for all wood warblers, Parulidae. And as a side note, it's now a member of the genus Setophaga, meaning moth-eating, along with the Kirtlands, Cape May, and common yellowthroat. The northern parula breeds throughout much of eastern North America, from Florida up through the South and the mid-Atlantic into Maine and southern Canada. This relative lack of specificity in habitat gives it a wide geographic range, which is only constrained by moist forests being available and epiphytes, or certain mosses that they use to construct their nests. It adapts and will feed on insects and mites both in its usual niche at the ends of mid-story branches, but when it's coexisting with the yellow-rumped warbler or the black-throated green, that it feeds from that niche. But if they migrate further north, which they do, the parula then expands and forages at both the lower and inner branches as well, showing how not being a specialist can also be adaptive and beneficial to your bird species. So that's what I have today on specialization among warbler species and how that specialization can both benefit and threaten the survival of those species, and why that necessitates a deep understanding of the factors that make up the ecology in which these tiny migrating birds thrive. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing here in a second and open it up to any questions.
Okay, before we do questions, I'm going to have them stand and stretch for a couple of minutes. All right, so please stand up and stretch. All right, don't have the mask on. Thanks so much. All right. They've got all day doing this, so we've got to get some blood flowing. All right, in their bodies. It was really good. All right. As a question writer, all right, I can see 1,000 questions on ecology here, right, that you could use, really complex ones. So it was a really wonderful presentation. All right, for us. Okay. You want to do jumping jacks, do jumping jacks, okay? Yeah, sometimes that's the thing to do. Thank you, Bella. There you go. She is not shy. Okay, how about questions? Bella.
I thought I thought yellow-rumped warblers and Cape May warblers were generalist species. It's just part of their niche includes the wax myrtleberries and the spruce berries.
No, so that's a very good observation. So I characterize them as specialists, and certainly in the literature, the Cape May is along with, say, the black-throated green and a few other warblers described as a spruce budworm specialist. But as you said, those are niches that apply during certain parts of the year. So the fact that the yellow-rumped is able to digest the waxy coating of the bayberry allows it to outcompete and extend its range further north, or the focus on taking the spruce budworms only from the tips of the upper branches when there are other species present and feeding those. Again, they make up approximately, typically a third of the stomach contents of observed birds on the Cape May show that 1/3 of the stomach is made up entirely of spruce budworms. Everything else is the other foods they take. So it gives them, since they are dependent upon it for growing their clutches so rapidly in response to those boom cycles, it's not that they're limited to that food stuff. It's not like the Kirtland warbler and its habitat, which is severely limited, but certainly it drives a large aspect of their ability to survive and grow their populations. So, perhaps like you said, niche is a better description for those traits.
Any other questions? Peter, what's the most amazing thing you heard today about?
I like the spruce budworm.
Yeah, what did you like about that budworm?
Huh?
What did you like about the budworm?
Oh, it was only like this one bird can eat it.
So as long as that bird's not there, it's going to live, huh? Okay. How about you? Go ahead.
And I was going to say, one thing that didn't really make it into the talk there is, why we care about whether or not warblers and other birds writ large have access to those insect species. We talked about how the spruce budworm is a pest and it can decimate some of those forests. I know every year in like Minnesota and Ontario, for example, they have large tracts of the forest die off. But, I think the bigger picture is that if we did not have the right habitat and foodstuffs to encourage these birds to survive, our bug problems would be even worse and get more out of control. And we would need to treat them with synthetic organic pesticides or other means. And it just really becomes a vicious cycle. So, it's one of those areas where I hearken back to what I said at the end about making your habitat as native and natural as you can to help really benefit these birds. And in turn, they'll benefit us. I look at, when I talked about how the brown-headed cowbird, for example, was trapped and removed or eliminated from the nesting range of the Kirtland warbler, typically birds in the US are protected under several laws, not just the Endangered Species Act, but the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And that makes it a crime to harm or interfere with the nesting of most bird species that you see around you. However, there are carve-outs for certain types of birds, typically considered agricultural pests or invasive exotics. So European starlings and house sparrows, for example, are not protected. They're invasive exotics that were introduced here. and people could trap or kill them or, take their nests apart. Farmers, on the other hand, have many agricultural carve-outs. A lot of times they would see various blackbirds eating, or as they thought, eating their seeds that they had planted, or eating the corn or eating other things off their crops. Whereas scientists, as they've actually studied some of those birds, found that they're not actually hurting the crops, they're beneficial to them. So some of the birds that have taken corn kernels, for example, they're taking corn kernels that were infected by bugs, and they are eating those aspects. So they're actually improving the health of the plants, or they're taking insects that would be blighting the entire area of plants. So it's really important to me to be able to see that complex interplay between the different species and not think of it as having like a brute force tool, like a pesticide, just to keep the bugs from touching your gardens or your farms.
Bella?
Hearing you mention that remind me, I wanted to share, during China's Cultural Revolution, one of the pests they tried to eradicate was Eurasian tree sparrow, because it just ate so many crop seeds. So like school children would just like be on the streets catching Eurasian tree sparrows and try to get rid of it. And then they succeeded, and the locusts pretty much decimated their crops, because even though the Eurasian tree sparrow ate some seeds, it ate even more locusts. I think they ended up importing Eurasian tree sparrows back from Russia.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation and point, and it's spot on. It also reminds me of something I didn't mention about one of the species that I was talking about here. So I talked about the birds on their nesting habitat or during migration. I didn't say much about where they overwinter. And the Kirtland's warbler, just like it has a very limited habitat in Michigan in the Lower Peninsula for nesting, it has a fairly restricted overwinter habitat, largely in the Bahamas. And a lot of times, particularly, we have the luxury, so to speak, in the developed world where we can focus on understanding and coexisting with some of the life forms, whereas developing economies, you see a lot more efforts and people don't take as much care of their local species. But in the Bahamas, it actually, local conservationists worked with the local populations, and they've done so much as they've taught children to respect and protect the Kirtland's warbler on its overwinter habitat. And they see it as a draw for tourists to come and see them. They see it as beneficial to take care of them. And I like to see more of that happening around the world. I know when I was in Malaysia photographing some particular birds, I remember my guide saying, when you check these into eBird, do not check them in with the specific lat long that we are at today. Because he goes, what happens is poachers are watching these check-ins, they see where someone has checked this bird in, and they show up and catch it for the cage bird trade or for food. And thus we checked it in at a park about a mile away, which messes with the science a little bit. You're not seeing exactly where it is. And I will say that Cornell has worked to mask off the locations shown for sensitive species to help alleviate that problem and still get good scientific data about their distribution and locations. But it shows some of the challenges that go beyond just the environmental factors and into how we as citizen scientists reporting this information could in fact pose threats to the species.
That's amazing. And, so what do they do with the birds that they track?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
If you have birds that you have monitors on that you're tracking, how do they protect those?
Yeah, I mean, by and large, a lot of, so if you're talking about birds that so there are several different ways we track birds. And actually some of our good friends are ornithologists working for the University of Florida and for the Florida Department of Wildlife. And they actually capture Mississippi kites, which are a type of migratory raptor that you find in South America and up into the American South. And she will go up in trees, catch them, and they put bands on them, and sometimes they even put transmitters on them so that you can follow their movements and see where they go via those transmitters. For banded birds, and there are banding stations in this area. I believe one of the gentlemen who works at a local wild bird center has said that down at Occoquan, yearly they have set up a mist net, that the very fine net that the migrating birds will fly into, be caught, and then trained professionals come out, handle them, put bands on them, and then release them. And then if you catch ones that have a band, you record the band and the serial number so that you can track their movements passively. But there's nothing really done to protect them. It's more just to monitor them.
Yeah.
It's more with Cornell and with eBird, what they do is they simply mask out the location to the general public and make it available only to their own researchers if you are reporting bird sightings that are of sensitive species or are in particularly sensitive habitats.
Thank you. Bella has another question.
Oh,
Certainly.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to mention that the tracker data is only available to the researchers, but eBird is meant to double as a scientific database and also a way for citizens to see, like, if they want to see this particular bird, where can I find it?
Yeah. Amber, you have some questions.
Absolutely. And in the past, if you were a bird watcher, there would be local phone numbers you could call and get recorded messages of rarities. These days, you pull up eBird as an interested birder and say, what are some of the rare birds seen near me? Or what are some of the birds seen at this area in this time, which makes it really convenient.
Any questions?
What are some of the ways that these wood warblers are like preventing brown-headed cowbirds from like laying eggs in their nests? So like the Kirtland's warbler.
So I don't think Kirtland's had much of a mechanism to prevent the laying in nests, maybe nest location and siting. So they do prefer to have them where they have that low enough cover that still has openings large enough for the parents to go to and from the nests. I think with Kirtland's, it was more the fact that there was human intervention to help remove the brown-headed cowbird from the nesting grounds. There are other species I've seen, for example, I've seen eastern bluebirds that will abandon a nest if a brown-headed cowbird lays an egg in it. I've seen some bluebirds try to flip those eggs out of the nest. Sometimes they can damage their own when they're trying to do that, so it's not a perfect solution. Certainly we're not fans of seeing the cowbirds show up, particularly around this time of year when we do have species like the bluebirds and some of the others who are nesting in our yard right now.
Bella.
Oh, I wanted to add in response to your question that brown-headed cowbirds, because of their ecology, they only really live in wide open spaces. Because before humans started living in North America, they would follow the bison around and eat the insects the bison stirred up. And Kirtland's warblers and birds like wood thrushes, they live near the center of an undisturbed forest. So they've never encountered brown-headed cowbirds in their evolutionary history. It's only when, like, if we build a road through the middle of the forest, even if most of the forest is intact, now there's open space and the brown-headed cowbird can get in on the edge of the forest. And now those Kirtland warblers, they have no defense against the brown-headed cowbirds because they didn't evolve.
That's a great explanation.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And I didn't talk about fragmentation, but I know with that's a large issue affecting many species of birds. But with the Kirtlands alone, there were significantly better density of Kirtland's warblers and better nest successes when the habitat is less fragmented. And I suspect what you just said about not having those edges where the cowbirds are introduced, having the larger contiguous forest available to them, that's one of the reasons why.
Reason. Question? How about some others? We've had some good discussions. Some of you are really, well, Bella is and Andrew is, all right, into all of these. But these are all applications to ecology actually in general, all right? This is how the concepts of each species survival and reproduction, all these things that we're talking about with birds. Birds are like the sentinel species, all right? If they survive, we survive. If they don't survive, we do not survive. And if that's one concept, if you don't leave here without any other concept that is important to your life, that is it. They are very small in some case species, but your whole life depends on them. Any other questions for John or comments? Yes.
So you mentioned that Cape May warblers generally feed in the upper canopy for the spruce budworms. Do they have any adaptations that might specifically help them feed higher up on the trees compared to other warblers, or are they just like a preference?
No, that's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, I do not have a good answer to it. I don't know if there is a specific, adaptation that enables them to feed higher up, or if there's a reason that, functionally why they can do so, but other birds don't. I do know when there are periods of bad weather, it tends to drive them in and lower in the trees as well, as kind of would be expected. So, I'm not sure, but that's a fantastic question, and I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for it.
Other questions? So that is another hand. Yes.
Why do
Richard.
you think the conservation program for the Kirtland warbler was kind of especially successful compared to other programs, especially given how critically endangered it was?
He said, say it louder.
Why do you think the conservation program for the Kirtland warbler was especially successful, especially given how critically endangered it was?
Right. No, that's a great question. So I think there are several factors. One, they were a high profile species, much like the whooping crane has been. So they got a lot of attention from humans to take care of them. Even though they're these small birds that are really geographically limited and that you don't tend to see everywhere, they were kind of splashy and got a lot of attention. They were one of the first species protected under the Endangered Species Act. So, again, they were one of the first we were able to deal with. And honestly, the particular steps that were needed to protect them, there were really only those three factors. So, not to dismiss that any of them are not in and of themselves complex, but eliminating brown-headed cowbird nest predation by removing the brown-headed cowbirds from that environment and by making their remaining habitat less fragmented, that's one of them. Managing those forests and realizing that they do depend only on that very specific, that 8 to 15 year age of jack pine, that was critical. And having, being in an area of the country where there was still enough jack pine, the Michigan's Lower Peninsula is not, a largely urbanized area. It's mostly agricultural and rural. That habitat was there and could be purchased by the state, by private landowners, and turned over to be managed and protected. And finally coming up with that rolling wave to be able to manage the forests incrementally, so there's always sufficient habitat available without having to run the risk of controlled burns. I think those were some of the real reasons that we were successful. Certainly I do worry, thinking back to some of my genetics courses, I worry that population size shrunk to such a low level that we could get some genetic fixation with it having been such a small population that has rebounded. We see that with other species as well. The spoon-billed sandpiper, of course, which I've had the pleasure to see in Southeast Asia. There are very few of those birds left. They're actually trying to raise them in zoos in like London and then re-release the chicks into the wild in Siberia and in Asia each year. Yeah, but I think some of the other efforts that have been more complex, so you look at like the Florida scrub jay, for example, and there's really much less habitat to maintain and preserve for it because Florida is so developed compared to Michigan's Lower Peninsula or up into Ontario and parts of Wisconsin. So, you know, we had the availability of the habitat and it wasn't a huge deal to protect it. And I'll say when I went to see the Kirtland's warbler, that was actually one of the big draws to that area. There were, you know, hotels, restaurants, businesses that were just booming for those months during the summer with birders who would come just to see these birds. And, you know, obviously that's not sustainable for the whole year, but again, it gave one more factor to help drive, you know, a reason for us to help protect them, not just the fact that they were the splashy, sensationalistic, you know, early case of an endangered species.
Any other questions? Yes.
How and also why does the Cape May warbler like evolve their tubular tongue for sound, since it's quite different from like, you know, the insects?
Yeah, so I don't know a whole lot about, you know, the evolutionary steps that came about for the Cape May's tongue, if I heard your question correctly. Certainly, it gives the Cape May warbler an advantage that other warblers during migration do not have, that ability to feed from nectar. And, you know, they are competing with non-warbler species for that nectar. So there's hummingbirds, there are tanagers who eat fruit, there are flower piercers that will drink nectar from the base of flowers. But, you know, as they're migrating through the United States, particularly on the eastern seaboard, there are not that many other birds that eat nectar. So I can see where that would be a very beneficial trait to have developed, and how it gives them a leg up over the competition as they're migrating and getting to their breeding grounds.
Bella.
I wanted to point out though, like when we say a bird's tongue is tubular, we don't mean it extends out like a proboscis. It comes out flat like any other tongue, and then when it's in the liquid, it like folds over like a burrito, and then.
No, thank you. That's a perfect description for it. So yeah, it's not exactly. It is not a proboscis like a mosquito's. It does curl up to allow them to you know, take the nectar from you know, even from hummingbird feeders.
That's interesting. You know, some humans can fold their tongue like that, and other humans can't. Okay, so maybe that's something within the person. That's definitely genetic. All right, so good observation. All right. Anybody else with any questions at all? All right, let's take a favorite bird, Carolina.
Probably the Kirtland's warbler.
Really? Do you know?
Oh wait, from the presentation or
No,
just in
that
general?
you have.
Oh, in general? Okay. Probably the snowy owl.
Snowy owl?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you know about it?
I just know that it looks pretty cute.
Well, and it's one, when you see it have those eruptions from the north, because, and scientists believe it's due to larger rodent populations and I forget which particular rodent. When they show up in this area, people will flock to wherever they are to get a glimpse of them. So I certainly see snowy owl as a top favorite.
Zing, how about you? What's your favorite bird?
My favorite bird is a baby emperor penguin. I think they're very cute.
Baby emperor penguin. Why?
Certainly.
I think they're very adorable, but I've also heard that they smell like fish for some reason. Not like.
Smell like what?
Fish.
Fish. Jonah, how about you?
Oh, mine's a cardinal.
Beautiful bird. Yes. Lots of cardinals around here, females and whatever. I have them outside of my home as well. And I don't know much about birds, or I mean, I know something about birds, but one of the things that I observed near my own home, I like to go out and just sit in my yard and watch. And I saw these birds feeding on Leatris, which is flower, all right, outside. And they peck, 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 peck. And I thought, what are those, you know? And they weren't the bright yellow that I thought they'd be goldfinch. But with research, I found out they were goldfinch, but it was ones that were non-breeding, right? And so when John was talking about how they look at different times of the year or different species, all right, that's a very important concept, all right, of how they're actually protecting themselves, okay, without that huge display of those bright yellow colors and leaves or wings, all right, that they have. And then I just sat there for quite a long time just watching them, all right? And that's what you're going to be doing on, hopefully we'll see some birds on Sunday, all right, when you do the nature journaling, all right, with Avery Gunther. She's at Fairfax County. She's a naturalist there, so they're going to meet with her and do that. But it's all about observation. John has amazing observation skills. Anyone that uses a camera, all right, you are behind that lens, but you are looking for all kinds of things, okay? And the more you use that, the more you're able to see, right, with it. Any other questions, comments? Sophie, do you have a favorite bird?
Favorite bird? I did Adelaide penguin.
Penguin as well? Okay. How about someone with a different bird? Yes, Andrew.
I like the red-winged blackbirds just because when they fly, like you can see the red shoulder and it looks super cool.
I like them too, but I live out in a place called Franklin Farm, and we have all these ponds, and we have these stands of rushes, and we have cattails and all that, and I have to be really careful as I walk around that pond, all right? They love to dive bomb, all right? This is their territory, all right? Even though we have these little paths around there, and they are notorious, all right, for doing it. And I have a tiny dog, as most of you know, and so I have to watch out for her when we're making these little walks around the area. But that's amazing, all right, to watch them and not watch the red-winged. How about another bird? Yes.
So mine is kind of weird. My favorite bird is the Carolina wren.
Carolina wren.
I'm from North Carolina. My last name is Wren.
Yeah. Without the W. Anything else about that bird?
They're very cute.
Yeah, they are cute. Anybody else? Yes.
A harpy eagle, because of like their plumage, like especially like, from the back of their head.
Yeah, absolutely gorgeous. So, anything else? Thank you for interacting with John, because he's got such a background, all right? And we're so lucky that he had time for you, all right, today.
No, and I appreciate you guys taking the time this morning to listen to me ramble on about one of my favorite subjects, about birds, and the fantastic questions and interactions that you had. I'll very quickly say what one of my favorite birds is. I mean, we love the eastern bluebirds in our yard. We love watching them take care of their nest and their babies. But one that is my absolute favorite is the barred antshrike. This is a bird that you find in South and Central America. And he's just, to me, he's cute. He's covered in these stripes. They chase around ants. They're very secretive. I remember standing in the sun in Panama for, I don't know, 2.5 hours waiting for him to actually pop out and get a picture. And I just loved finally seeing him, finally getting that perfect picture of him, and going home having seen a new bird during the time.
Yeah. Okay, so this is passion, all right? You will all have some passion in your life. Make sure you spend time with that passion, all right? It may not be in biology or whatever, but there's something in your life, and that's what makes you happy as a human being, all right? And able to share who you are. And John has just shared his passion for birds, all right? Knowing full well you want an IT, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. But you make time for that, okay? You don't infringe upon others, but you do. I love to watch him when he's going all of his trips. He was just down in the Southwest here recently, all right, photographing. And that cover with that picture of the bird is his favorite. Yeah, that was one of his latest books, I believe, right? The latest one? Yep.
It's two books back, I think.
Okay,
But
two books, okay.
my latest one has a wide-eyed vireo on the cover that, you know, we were photographing down in Texas, and it flew up and it would sing right along with us. So you'd try to whistle his songs and he'd sit there and cock his head, look at you, and then sing right back at you. And, you know, it's a lot of fun when you get to have those kinds of interactions with birds as well, when they're not just skittish and take off when you barely look at them.
And I think the other important thing for me, at least that I've observed here, is that it's about time. He said 2.5 hours he waited. And I know you're in the world of, you know, instant everything, all right?
My Southeast Arizona trip, I had a bird blind reserved at one of the sanctuaries there. And they said you have it from dawn until noon. And if you're there in the summer, dawn is around 5 a.m. So some people might say, wow, you're going to sit there for 7 hours watching and taking pictures of birds. Well, you know, I used up my time in the blind. I went and had lunch, came back and sat in their gardens for another 2.5 hours, waiting for a particular hummingbird to show up, which I fortunately did get. So, you know, bird watching certainly takes a lot of patience, and, you know, you have to be able to observe both with your eyes and your ears. I do a huge amount of identifying birds by their call, and if I hear something that I don't recognize, that tells me to start looking around for it, because, you know, it's something new for me and I need to find out what's making that sound.
Thank you, John. Fantastic. Okay. And thank you. You were great too.
Thank you, everyone.